You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to Raincoast Radio's first series of Wolves and Women. I'm Chelsea Greer, Director of Raincoast Wolf Conservation Program, and your host for this series of conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. Today, I am excited to be joined by large carnivore expert and Raincoast Senior Scientist, Paul Paquet. Welcome, Paul.
It's a pleasure to be here, Chelsea.
Can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Certainly, I'm Paul Paquet, senior citizen with Raincoast Conservation Foundation. I think that's more appropriate than senior scientist. So my research area, of course, as a carnivore biologist, is primarily interest in carnivores and the ecology and conservation of large carnivores throughout North America and really the world. So.
Yeah, and you've been involved in large carnivore research for well over 40 years now. But I want to go all the way back to the beginning. What led you to want to study wolves?
That's not a difficult question at all. So it's more than 50 years now that I've been studying large carnivores. I was always attracted to canids being dogs and wolves and foxes, etc., even as a child. And it was a large part of what my imagination was just a close association and affinity with dogs initially, and then wolves. So that was the attraction, really. And that interest developed over time as I matured. So some part of that affection, really, for those various animals was redirected to trying to understand them and understand them through research, primarily scientific research. And my interest being to engage them directly rather than indirectly, as I had mostly in the past with wolves in particular. I was introduced to dogs as a child, and those are my first memories, really, are cuddling with a dog rather than a person. And I think I probably, maybe in retrospect, appreciated that more than I did with cuddling with my mother, to be honest. So it's just a long history. And of course, I was exposed to a lot of stories about wolves, including Jack London's writings on White Fang and Call of the Wild, and including dogs as well, or Rudyard Kipling, for example, and the Jungle Book. That was always interest, and even symphonies, Peter and the Wolf, which was a Russian symphony written for children. As I was fascinated by it as a child because, of course, Peter tames a wolf in the story, and it's a narrated symphony for children. So I think those were really, really what encouraged me to, initiate and begin to study wolves in a more formal way, and that would be essentially as a scientist and as a student.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like there's a common theme with a lot of these interviews about the connection that everyone has made with their dogs, and it just kind of shows how unique and important and special those relationships we have with our dogs are.
Yeah, it's universal. There's no doubt about that. And certainly the people I've worked with and the people that I know all, have stories not dissimilar from my own.
Yeah, and what are some of the more unique or memorable opportunities or experiences that you've had to study wolves in the wild?
Well, I think that all experiences that I've had in the wild, and this is, again, globally, have been outstanding experiences and memorable for me. Those would include those in North America. My most memorable early on was in Alaska, northern Alaska, working with biologist Bob Stevenson, and this was in the Brooks Range, and with Barry Lopez. Barry Lopez was an author who, at the time, was working on a new book that was called Of Wolves and Men. And I had the wonderful opportunity to spend a summer with Bob and again, Barry. That was an incredible time for me. Of course, working in Russia and in Ukraine and Poland and the Carpathian Mountains in Europe during the time in period when it was still communist, but the quiet revolution and gentle revolution was taking place particularly in the Carpathian mountains of there. And again, having the opportunity to work with wolves in those regions, and as well as the people. Again, that was important. Also working with wolves in the wild in parts of Canada, including in the Rocky Mountains and wide range Jasper National Park and in all four of the Rocky Mountain National Parks, and then into Manitoba and working with wolves there, partly in Riding Mountain, partly in the north, back into Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and being able to work with wolves in those regions in very, very direct ways and intimate in so many ways. They were all exciting. And, it's equally exciting for me to encounter and have an opportunity to work with wolves in a rural area, for example, where you might not expect to find them and so on. It's just wherever the wolves are and if I'm there with them, that's exciting.
Yeah, and that's a good example of how widespread wolves are with all of those places that you listed. And many of these experiences ultimately led you to work with each of the women that we've interviewed for this series, which is a series that we developed together. So from your perspective, I'd love to hear what inspired this initial idea for this series of Wolves and Women.
I think it's intrigued me from the time that I began working formally as an academic with wolves, that there were a number of women who were simultaneously involved in research, particularly in behavior and other captive studies as well as field studies. And I had the fortune, great fortune, to get to know some of these women and, learn from them so many different things that I hadn't learned previously. And I didn't really think of it in terms of, well, there's women and there's men and they're doing different things. It was just women doing wolf research. And there were a number of them during the 1970s. It seemed to be emerging. And I was really attracted to the research that they were doing in many, many ways, because I found it to be very solid and informative. But I thought many times, many of these women and collectively had not really been given the recognition that they should have, in part because of the contributions that they had made that were really important in our understanding of wolves and the conservation and behavior and ecology, and the contributions were immense. For whatever reason, they just weren't always recognized. And so I thought, it's really important that these women be recognized for what they've done and what they've contributed over the years in a very special way. And that's really, I think, what motivated me to talk with you in particular about it and see if this is reasonable or if something of interest. And I think that it was.
Yeah, and we've been talking about it for a while, and I'm really glad that it's finally being done. And it's especially special to me, I think, as I'm going to be becoming a mother soon, and just being able to talk with all these inspiring women. And yeah, it's been a really special experience so far. And there's so many fascinating stories that have been shared by these women. So I would love to hear your memory of some of these stories, some about their amazing research that they've done, but some are, kind of funny personal stories. And one that I think of Diane shared so many different stories of her time as a wolf researcher, but I think the one that I might have enjoyed the most was the story of you looking after her dog, or I don't know if she had more than one dog, and her walking in on you, feeding them ice cream. I would love to hear your memory of that story.
I remember it well. So that would be Diane Boyd, who was a researcher and a colleague. When Diane and I were working together, and we both had dogs at the time, I often would babysit her dog when she was in the field, mostly in her efforts to capture wolves for our research project. So she couldn't have her dog with her at the time. And so I would be the babysitter and stay home. So I had always and continuously seem to have no rules for dogs. They can do what they want, and I tend to share things with them. Diane was a little stricter in both her training and how she related to the dogs. So I remember really clearly Diane coming home, and at the time we were living in a small cabin near Banff National Park in a place called Harvey Heights. It was a log cabin, no indoor plumbing. And when she arrived home, I was sitting on the couch with her dog and two of my dogs, really, not just one. It was Tashi and Sheba, and we were eating ice cream. And I had the ice cream container, and we would each have a bite of the ice cream, but from my spoon. I didn't know that Diane was there, and she walked in, and so that was what was in process at the time. And I was feeding her dog off a spoon, my spoon, ice cream. And anyway, all I could hear is this laughter, and I looked up. It was Diane.
That's a great memory. I feel like that seems like a dream to me. I would love to be sitting on a couch sharing ice cream with a bunch of dogs. Despite whatever they put in their mouths, I will still be okay with sharing a spoon.
Yeah, I still do that, and much to the many people are not happy about that. I mean, to be polite, have other words of saying.
Yeah, we've talked about letting our dogs. Well, this wasn't my dog in particular, but I lived with two large dogs during my graduate research, and my roommate had rules for them, but when it came to being kind of like a natural compost or like helping us clean the dishes, there was no rules. They would often be our first wash of the dishes, and then we'd also let them wash the cast iron, which a lot of people thought was pretty gross because you don't usually wash cast irons with soap. But we figured if anything, the germs would be burnt off, and it was enjoyable enough to take the risk.
Yeah, I know of my three dogs at one time, we used to call them three waters, and they were the first wash for all of the dishes and the pans and so on. So, and I've continued with that.
Yeah, my husband has politely asked me when we got a dog that could we please not let our dog wash the dishes? And I said, that's fair. We don't even have a dishwasher. So, yes, we do not let our dog wash the dishes now, but I can look back on memories at least.
And I did, by the way, let the wolves lick the dishes as well and clean them when I was babysitting them. And these were several captive wolves that came in from the wild, and they always seem to appreciate that opportunity.
Yeah, good bonding.
Yeah.
Well, beyond the pure bliss, I'm sure you experienced sharing ice cream with yours and Diane's dogs. I'd love to hear about what it was like to work alongside Diane as a researcher. You know, we briefly talked about her time working in Yoho, Banff, and several other Canadian national parks. Where and when did your paths cross during this time?
You know, we met fairly early by phone initially and then by correspondence. Keeping in mind there wasn't really an active internet at that time. So it was probably about 1988 or 87. And Diane was working in the Northern Rockies in the US. That'd be the Southern Rockies of Canada. And I was at that time working with the University of Montana and Bob Ream and others who were responsible for the wolf research that was taking place in that region of the US at the time, and who Diane was working with and for. So originally, Bob Ream put me in touch with Diane because I was really interested in the work she was doing and what she was finding out and so on. And when I came to do research in Banff National Park after working in Jasper on wolves and caribou starting about 1986, but down to Banff in about 1989, I made contact again with Diane because it was clear that we had interesting work that she had already done. And of course, she was far more knowledgeable and informed about what was happening in that region, including likely in Banff National Park and south into the US, particularly in the region we call the Kananaskis outside of Banff National Park. It's a protected area within Alberta, and then also along the west side of the Rocky Mountains down around in Vermeer and south, farther down into Fernie and the Flathead region. So I know of her work there and sort of anticipated that this would be of interest for her as well. And so that just was, started talking, but ultimately that resulted in our working together. And I was just thrilled because I had such admiration for her and the work she'd done. And we just developed a really, really close and wonderful working relationship. We were just seemed so fit for one another. It was really, I felt privileged in so many ways to be able to working with her. And initially, the work that we did, and she was able to direct, was in Banff National Park, and then again back into Kananaskis, and that was capturing wolves at that time. And of course, we were doing a lot of capturing and handling of wolves and radio coloring. And so I had asked Diane whether she could help with that because she had a good history of and was something that she was quite able to do. So that's what happened. And Diane came north. I was living right outside of Banff at the time. I think I mentioned the house, the cabin, and that's where we operated out of. And she initiated some additional trapping and handling and collaring of the wolves. And I worked with her. She was really the lead on all of that. And during the next off and on over the next 2 years, we did collar a number of wolves. I remember Midnight in particular. It was a young, solid black wolf, and then there was Dusk, another younger wolf, but clearly a female, who, from our observations of her that we were able to do with Diane, she was the dominant female in the pack and later the breeding female. So we continued working together for the next 10 years in that region and elsewhere. I was with her as she completed her master's at the University of Montana, I believe, and then later for her PhD. I was an ex officio supervisor during that time on her work. But we had a lot of adventures and fun. It was just such a wonderful, wonderful relationship. It's memorable and one I could never forget. It was just, I have to say, of all of the people I've known and ever worked with, Diane is right up there as probably outside of Anita, who I'm married to, but probably the closest that I've ever had, that relationship. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, and looking back at the Wolf Project in Banff National Park in the early 1990s, this is really where Diane crossed paths with another one of our podcast guests, Shelley Alexander, who I understand was also a big part of that project.
No, that's absolutely right. And Shelley was a big part of all of that. And so we had this, and Shelley as well. And so we had this working group that was exceptional and capable and able. Shelley and Diane were working together, and I was working with both of them. You can't imagine the opportunity that was. Diane sometimes would work alone when she was trapping, and Shelley and I would be there to assist, usually when there was a capture or some sort of follow-up. But, working with Shelley, where we would do observations at den sites and of wolves in the areas where we knew that they were, because we had the radio telemetry so that we could observe them. And Shelley, like Diane, was just also remarkable. I mean, I can't say enough about Shelley. And so yeah, it really wonderful times. Made so because of the people I was able to work with, and during that period, and foremost there would be Shelley and Diane. Certainly, they continued to do the kind of work that we were doing in Banff and surrounding areas, and we ended up publishing the papers together, and had other follow-ups over the years. So Shelley sort of pioneered work on issues around habitat, even for wolves, but also interactions with other species, including other carnivores. Did really some of the pioneering work in Banff on highways as well, not often acknowledged or recognized by others, but she was involved in that very, very early on. And then she initiated her own research in that area as part of her master's and PhD. This was really, really important. But also the work that she did do in captivity, captive wolf pack. So she had that experience of being able to work with wolves in the wild and wolves in captivity, but also learn a lot about wolf behavior, how to interpret it, which is really helpful when you're working with wolves in the wild.
Yeah, and while you were working with Shelley, documenting the return of wolves to Banff, she was featured in this amazing Canadian Geographic spread called The Wolf Man, which I believe was in reference to you, but Shelley was also a big part of this article. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that came about?
Well, Shelley was a big part of that. Shelley and I had been working together for a number of years before that article came out in the Canadian Geographic. So I had met her initially, I think it would have been 1990. And we were in she might not remember this. I met her in a grocery store. She was there with her boyfriend at the time, and she introduced herself. For whatever reason, she knew me, and it's probably because of the work that we were doing that she was interested in the park. We got to chatting, of course, and it was obvious that she was really very interested in research, particularly interested in wolves and other large carnivores, I might say. She was in between her finishing her undergraduate degree and wanting to go on in business primarily for a graduate degree, I think at University of Calgary. But she became one of the members of our research team in Banff National Park in the tracking and following and monitoring of wolves in the wild. That work received a lot of attention in Canada and elsewhere. There were a number of stories that were done in other magazines as well as in newspapers, etc. It just seemed to never stop. And so Canadian Geographic was interested, really, I think, as a consequence of that, seeing all of that attention. And they approached it a little bit differently than did others, and sort of emphasized, as you know, the story was the Wolf Man, which did refer to me, but the story was much broader than that. It was less focused. So I think there were different, over the period of 3 years, or 4 or 5 magazine articles on that work.
Yeah, there's some amazing photos in that spread as well. And I was also, because you mentioned a TV show that there was perhaps a character based on Shelley, and we didn't have time to dive into this, but Shelley had mentioned that there was, that TV show, The West Wing, and there was an episode, I think it was in 1999, called the Crackpots and These Women, and the story of Pluie was told within that TV series. I don't know if that's the show that you were referring to, but one example of, I guess, the many stories that came out of that, because Pluie was kind of part of that work as well, like tracking her movements in Banff and in other areas as well.
Yes, Pluie was a very famous wolf, and just briefly why she was famous. She was captured and radio collared using a satellite collar in 1991. I believe Shelley was part of that capture team together with Graham Neal. So it was Shelley and Graham. So they were responsible for collaring Pluie. As I said, satellite collars were brand new. They'd never been used on wolves previously. And so this was experimental, and we weren't monitoring a lot of wolves directly in that manner. So she was the first. But what was so unique about it is we were able to get locations quite regularly, of course, without having to be on the ground ourselves or in the air flying to locate them, but from satellite. And early on, we started seeing Pluie making these long distance movements, or at least we believed we were seeing she was making long distance movements, but we needed to confirm that they weren't just airs coming from the satellite. And again, our concerns being that this is a new technology and maybe it's not being accurate in the information that's giving us. But as it turns out, they were real, and Pluie was moving huge distances. She was captured originally in Peter Lougheed Provincial Park in Alberta, just south of Banff National Park. She moved into Jasper National Park and then down the west slopes of the Rocky Mountains and back into Banff and then back into Peter Lougheed, and then went south into the Northern Rockies of the United States, and then made her way across into southern BC and Idaho Panhandle, and then into the state of Washington near Spokane, and down from Spokane over back to the Rockies to visit Diane Boyd and her work, and then down south farther near Yellowstone and back. And she spent time in all of those areas, and then returned on the east side of the U.S. Rocky Mountains and into Canada near Calgary, and then back to Banff National Park. And she did this route several times. So that was quite interesting. We were able to confirm, for example, that she was traveling with other wolves that appeared to be her pups, by the way, at times. But it was really remarkable and incredibly, obviously, informative at the time, as wolves are just beginning to recolonize those regions. Unfortunately, in whatever, 1992 or 93, I received a phone call from Fernie, BC, from a person who said that they had her radio collar, a satellite collar. And we talked, and he had found it up on Castle Mountain, which is behind south side of Fernie, when he was hunting. And so I asked him if he could return it, which he did and offered to do. And when I received it, it was only part of the collar. It was the part which carries the radio equipment and battery pack. And so it's a metal casing. And it had a bullet hole through it. So we made the assumption, wrongly as it turned out, that Pluie was likely dead and had been killed. And this was pretty obvious. That was wrong. And it was a year or 2 years later that I got a report from British Columbia on the east side of the Rockies near Invermere that Pluie had been killed by a hunter. And she still had the leather or fabric part of her collar around her neck. And it was had the information on it as to who to contact, and confirm. So she was dead, but her trek received a lot of attention, and everywhere from the New York Times to, as you said, TV shows. Her story was included in there because it was so fascinating and intriguing. And then Smithsonian caught on to the story, and they put together a display which traveled the United States. It had their information of Pluie and the entire story. Pluie, because of her remarkable treks, was an inspiration for many people in terms of recovering wolves into the Rocky Mountains and surrounding areas going west into BC. She was one of the primary reasons that Y2Y was found. That's the Yellowstone to Yukon conservation group and effort. Was based on her and the work that they do. In some ways, it was attempting to emulate her, long distance movements that she was making. So these were just on her part exploratory forays into those areas, looking to areas where she might be interested in, residing in the future. And were very, very influential.
Yeah, it's such a good example of how far wolves can travel. I mean, their home ranges can vastly vary as well. We've talked about them having a couple 100 square kilometer home ranges, which is still quite large. But then you also look at Pluie and these home ranges that are thousands of square kilometers, and even the Central Coast when you have more mountainous terrain and the terrain that they have to navigate to find resources.
It's such an important point. And, it does affect the size of the home ranges because only in these really rugged topographic areas like the Rocky Mountains or in the coastal ranges and so on, only a portion of that area is usable. So as a consequence, they tend to have much larger home ranges. I think if you extract or subtract a lot of the unusable slopes and elevations, et cetera, from their home ranges, the sizes of them are probably pretty equivalent to what you might find in less topographically rugged areas.
And then we also talked with Jane Packard. And I know you had mentioned that there's stories of Jane's early studies and work with wolves that were really inspirational to you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Jane was doing work on wolves in a more formal way earlier than I was, and I was paying close attention to the research she was doing and her publications, in part because they were just so well done and the research was so informative, and it was both novel and, again, a major contribution. Jane probably doesn't remember, but I started a correspondence with her because I was so interested in the work that she was doing and how it came about. But I hadn't met her. I was only indirect. But I met Jane in 1979 at the International Wolf Symposium in Portland, and she was there to make presentations. That's where I first got to know her. And I was several things happened simultaneously. First of all, I was really inspired by the work that she was doing, as I said, but also getting to just know her briefly there. I don't know that I had met anybody as generous and as open and helpful within that field, and certainly among the academics and the other researchers as Jane. And that really impressed me at the time. And I thought she was gracious in a way that, was just exceptional. And I talked with others about that, how somebody could be that helpful and encouraging and inspiring. And I remember right after the symposium in Portland, a number of us headed to Vancouver. That's Vancouver, BC, not Vancouver, Washington. I can't remember exactly. I think it was another wolf meeting, and Jane was there. And she was traveling with David Meach and others from Minnesota and the work there. But I remember her inviting me into sort of this group of people who I had always admired for a number of years, who had, again, been doing wolf research for much longer than me, that she was with, both for lunch and dinner and then for various meetings, And I never forgot that. It was really thoughtful on her part. I've never told her that, but it was so natural. I could see that on her, the way that she did that. And those are my early memories of Jane. And of course, she continued to do work through the years. It was always impressive.
Yeah, I think that really came through in her interview of just how thoughtful she is, not only in personal relationships, but also being thoughtful in her work and, how she approached even interpreting a lot of her results and thinking about, even wolf social intelligence. And yeah, it was a very interesting interview.
Yeah, she was very receptive to new ideas, and some of the new ideas actually came from her. So that was really important. And again, not often recognized, but thoughtful always.
Yeah, and you mentioned the International Wolf Symposium. I think Susan talked a little bit about being at that symposium presenting for the first time. I think she was still a teenager. So thinking about Susan Bragdon and her interview, one of the big things that we talked about was her work with you as a research assistant and kind of the story of what her observations revealed. So I'd love to hear what you were thinking when Susan brought forward her observations on the role of female wolves.
Well, just to back up a little bit, it was Susan, I think she was maybe 14 years old when we first met. And when she first started to work with me as an observer on captive wolf research that we were doing in Portland, Oregon, at the Washington Park Zoo. And again, these were wolves that came in from the wild initially and then were maintained in captivity. She was just an incredibly insightful observer and informal observation, as you well know, and particularly with behavior. We often use ethograms or guidance. These are lists of behaviors, et cetera, and things to look for and to check off. And they inform your viewing essentially and how you record what you see. And we had a number of observers, and she was one of them. My early concerns, because she was only 14 years old, was that, this is going to be difficult. She's too young to do this. But, after talking with her, decided, well, let's at least give her a chance to do this. Well, over time, and as the various daily reports on observations were returned, and I started to collate them and bring them together, she was seeing something quite different than what others were seeing. And she was recording behaviors that others weren't recording. And I thought, well, this is just a confirmation of my concerns earlier that she might be too young to be doing this. So I decided, well, I should see what it is she's maybe seeing that others are not, or is she just not seeing what others are seeing? And so I sort of quietly began to observe while she was observing as well, but she was unaware that I was there observing, just to see if we would coincide in our observations. Well, just to make the story shorter, as I started to realize, it didn't take long, that what she was observing and reporting on was accurate. What the rest of us were observing and reporting on was not. And this was really stunning, but really important, of course, for me. It was a lesson, obviously, and the advantages of not having preconceived ideas and having those influence how you observe. And it was clear, again, just to reiterate, that she was right in what she was seeing. And I started to understand, well, that's in large part attributable to her being naive. She had no expectations as to what she was supposed to see. So she saw what was real rather than what she should have seen based on what she had either read or had heard previously. The most important observation on her part, among many, was that within wolf packs, the females can be the essentially dominant animal in the pack, rather than what was believed at the time and was generally reported consistently, that adult males would be the dominant wolf within the pack, or as people sort of generically refer to him, the pack leader. But that's not what she was seeing based on the behaviors that she was recording and what we could determine from it. And as it turned out, she was right.
Yeah, so fascinating. And Just out of curiosity for myself too, at that time, because we often talk about the breeding pair, alpha pair, dominant pair, and Rick McIntyre has talked a lot about even just the female wolf being even more so out of that pair, the leader. Was that what was coming out in her observations as well? Was she seeing, okay, both there's a male and a female that these wolves look to, or was she seeing this like stand out observation that it was indeed like a female wolf that most of the wolves were looking to?
It was the latter, essentially. And I think it was pretty clear from my perspective. Ultimately, as we continued to monitor those wolves, that didn't diminish the importance of her counterpart, male wolf. And at the time, as you know, we were using the terms alpha and betas and omegas, et cetera, which essentially refer to wolves that are very, very dominant as an alpha, right? As compared to less so. So it was really important. So within the pack, she and others, of course, contributed. What we were seeing was essentially what Eric Zeeman, the German, well, actually Swedish originally, but working in Germany, researcher had observed in his captive pack in Germany and reported on. And essentially being that there are orders of both importance, but also of dominance within wolf packs. And that there's, as he had observed, there seemed to be one that was there with females and one with males. And then those two interacted, where one of the dominant, most dominant males or females would be the most dominant or most important individual in the pack as a leader. So it was, repeating some of that, the difference being she was seen of females, and not once, but, several times as that pack leader.
Yeah, and I remember her talking about the importance of being open to change as well, and even acknowledging, because we've talked a lot about, the labels that you can put on wolves and how it doesn't necessarily, it could accurately reflect what you're seeing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect how dynamic the wolves are, and how, with some of her observations, just being open to that change where that shift can happen within packs. It's not just, okay, this is the female leader and she is forever the female leader. There's a lot of change that can happen within those social dynamics.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Chelsea, and it is dynamic most of the time. And there's a lot of variance in individuals and their own behavior and how it's expressed. So, for example, you can have a dominant male for the pack, and some of them can be like benevolent leaders, very seldom aggressive towards other wolves, and very seldom expressing their dominance to others, but still being in that role and maintaining it. While others, as I said, can be very aggressive. And those are reflective of what we, as you know, call personalities in individual wolves, and again, how they manifest. So there's a wide range of behavior and in individual wolves. And then the combination of those behaviors within a wolf pack, when you have anywhere from, 5 to, let's say, 15 different animals. And that's something that Susan was pointing out as well. These things change, and they can change very, very rapidly, which she did observe. Further to all of that, what was, I think, remarkable, again, she was probably 17, maybe 16, her last year of high school in 1979, if I remember correctly. She presented this at the International Wolf Conference, and it was well received. And of course, part of that had to do with how really professional her presentation was.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive to be 17 in front of a lot of people that have inspired you and have been studying wolves for a long time. So must be a memorable experience for her, for sure.
And it was a memorable experience for me as well. She made other contributions to that. It was the first international symposium on wolves, and she was one of the organizers of that conference. She probably didn't mention that to you, but she played a significant role in the organization of it.
That's amazing. I want to move on to talking about Astrid Wikström, because a lot of her work is around wolf genetics, which utilizes, DNA samples taken from wolves or non-invasively collected from wolves or other species of what they've left behind. And you worked closely with Astrid in the field in Riding Mountain, but also on wolf genetics in various places. So I was wanting to hear about, something that's stuck out to you the most about her work, as it's been quite innovative.
Oh, there's so many things that I remember of her work that were of significance and importance. But let me back up and say that she was a student of mine in that I was a committee member for her at the University of Calgary, with her supervisor being Stephen Herrero. And Stephen Herrero was a bear biologist, but also a carnivore biologist at the University of Alberta at the time. Her original work and her master's was on caribou, and that's where we're working, but also that indirectly involved wolves. She continued with her PhD in the Maritimes in New Brunswick, and I continued on as being a committee member for her. And that's how we became involved more so in research directly on wolves and in particularly genetics. So she worked in the Rockies, she worked in BC, she worked in Prince Albert National Park and Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba, but also back in Eastern Canada. Because of her interest in genetics and its application to conservation of wolves, she collected genetics material from around, well, North America really, but focused on Canada. Some of what was really unique in her work was she was able to make clear distinctions among wolf populations as to where their origins were genetically and their relatedness, and also ideas of introgression of other wolves from other regions and potentially from coyotes as well, and some of their historical evolution, and development over time. That was a very big contribution. She found, for example, wolves in Riding Mountain National Park, which is about a 3,000 kilometer square park in the southern part of Manitoba, that the wolves there that inhabited were isolated from wolves elsewhere and had been there for quite some time, and that they were, I don't like to use the term, but essentially they were very pure northern wolves in the sense that there was no introgression that was obvious of other wolves. And that was in contrast with other wolves outside of Rocky Mountain National Park into Saskatchewan, into Alberta, Ontario, et cetera, that were showing different influences from different wolves and potentially from coyotes or wolves that might not really be gray wolves, depending on which geneticists you talk with. So those were really major contributions in the wolf arena that I think were, much appreciated, because those questions have been outstanding for many, many years as to the origins of wolves. Part of the questions that were there and the reasons for them is that wolves have been eradicated in so many areas of North America, and then they had recovered. And it was not necessarily clear who these wolves were and where they came from. So that was a contribution. She did something very similar, as you well know, working with us at Raincoast and universities on the West Coast in BC, and looking at coastal wolves and more interior wolves, and was able to show that there was a demarcation there and somewhat of an isolation among wolf populations from the interior and on the coast, so that you could probably identify genetically where wolves came from if you were to find them, elsewhere. So that was really important work too, and still is, used in conservation.
Yeah, and that question of who are these wolves, that always sticks with me, because that's a question that we've asked in the research that we're conducting now, of looking at wolf populations on the South Coast that are now recovering and returning. So where did they come from? Who are they?
Yeah, exactly. And genetics are one way of at least attempting to find this out.
Yeah, and this series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger, and I know you have lots of stories of Gudrun, and you've told me about kind of how it all started and how she first contacted you to come work with wolves. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that initial conversation.
Well, initially I was contacted by mail. So I received a letter from Austria, which caught my attention, and it was Gudrun. And Gudrun was writing to express her interest in the work that we were doing in the Rocky Mountains of Canada, and more so her interest in wolves overall and everywhere. And she had just completed her master's, I believe it was, and it was a focus on, I think she was doing, no, I can't remember exactly what it was, but nevertheless, it wasn't related to wolves. But that was her interest that she was expressing. So it's not unusual in working in projects like the ones we were doing in the Rocky Mountains to have a number of people contact you and ask if there might be a possibility of working on these projects and working with you. Many of them interested, of course, in doing graduate work and research. And so usually when that happens, I go back and forth, and that time by letter, is to get a bit more background on the person. And there's certain things you can't do, and that's just to ask a person, are you physically fit enough to do this and that? But after talking with Gudrun for a while, I had to ask if she came to Canada, is she prepared to do, rigorous outdoor work in the mountains? So anyway, again, to shorten this story a bit, I got a letter back, and she, allowed me a little bit of room. I didn't insult her that she happened to be an Olympic skier, a medal winner in the Norwegian Olympics in cross country or Nordic skiing. And that was just a few years earlier. She was also a world champion high mountain runner, which I didn't know about. But that's an area of competition that takes place throughout the world. Well, anyway, that's sort of suggested to me that she's likely physically fit and able to do the work in the Rockies. And of course, she did come to Banff and became part of the same project that Shelley was working on and I was working on. We were all, collaborators, colleagues. And she just was remarkable in what she was able to do and contribute. We frequently, because we tried to do everything by ground tracking as much as possible, often on skis or snowshoes. And because she was so proficient on skis and so physically fit, we often would have Gudrun do the tracking directly, because she was the only one who could stay up with the wolves. It was not uncommon, and you hear people who worked with her talking about it when we knew that there might be a wolf way up on the mountainside somewhere, or there had been a wolf kill up there. We didn't have access to the helicopter always, and we couldn't get there because there was so much snow and difficult, and it would be Gudrun, could you just go up there and check that out? Which she would do on her skis quite easily. And she continued with that for a number of years on a number of projects working for us. And there's funny stories about people not knowing who she is and what she's done in the past and what her abilities are, particularly on skis that, emerged over the years. One of them, which always delighted me, had to do with there was the British Army's Special Forces came to Banff in the winter of one year. And the reason they did that was for training, so that they could do mountain training in severe conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted to have something to focus on. And they had contacted me about the wolves. And so what they really wanted to do was to try and track the wolves as this team, special forces who were highly trained, highly fit, et cetera. So we said, fine. And they embarked on that. And this was over a period of several months. Meanwhile, as it turned out, they weren't able to do that. They weren't able to keep up with the wolves or follow them effectively. But simultaneously, Gudrun was. And, these are the most fit of the military personnel that you can imagine. And so it was a bit of an embarrassment, but also they were really respectful of Gudrun. And they expressed that to me quite clearly. And I still have those letters from them.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard that story before. I just think of a couple of films that were made featuring her just navigating this mountainside and it's zooming out. And it's like, yeah, it makes me think a lot about our work and accessibility and the limitations around that and how there just weren't really those limitations for her at all when you have that physical ability to just kind of run through the forest too and be able to sense the presence of wolves. Like beyond her physical abilities, she also had this amazing ability to sense where the wolves were and track them in that way too.
She did, and she did it intuitively. And she at one point explained to me that where she tracks and where she goes usually is where the wolves track and go. And part of that has to do with the landscape that they're working in. So there's some obvious routes of travel that are more efficient than others. That's what she attributed that to. And she was remarkably insightful in her, ability to track and the information. And, she worked in Prince Albert National Park in forests, work we were doing there, and did ground tracking again, a little easier landscape in the mountains. But another amusing story at the time is while she was working there, there was an organized international event, and that was a skiing event. And again, this time, it's essentially cross-country skiing. I was encouraging Gudrun. I said, you should enter that, Gudrun, just because you like to ski and it's a competition and you like competition and so on. I said, that's not something I can do. I'm just have my field skis. We don't have good skis for that and everything. The tracking skis are broader. And anyway, ultimately I convinced her and she did participate in it, nobody knowing who she was. And of course she was the winner of the whole thing. And she was kilometers, I think, ahead of everybody else at the finish line and nobody knowing who she was. And she was on these skis that weren't intended for that kind of competition at the time. But incredible person and, really sweet. And again, a very thoughtful person who was always helpful to others. And, the opportunity for me to be able to collaborate with someone like that, I just can't say enough about how appreciative I am of that and Gudrun. And of course, we stayed in touch continuously till the time of her death. And she did work again in other areas, including Rocky Mountain National Park, together with Astrid, which was really, really wonderful because they had a history together as well on these projects. So
yeah, and from interviewing all these women, it's really been evident that you were not only a friend but a mentor to many of them, and you've been a very important mentor to me and an inspiration in my life and to so many within Raincoast. What is your approach as a mentor?
Well, first of all, I don't view myself as a mentor. I really always have viewed myself as a collaborator, a colleague. Mentoring is always suggests to me there's something that creates, and this is sort of ironic, but a hierarchy that I don't think is very useful in working with people. Yeah, again, I see it as working with others as colleagues and in collaboration. And from that and that perspective and view, I think it's easier for me in the sense that I'm the one that's also learning all the time, as well as others. And so there's almost, and I've talked with Diane about this. I know that we were really close, and it was like if there's any mentorship taking place, it's like cross mentoring. And I think it's really, really important because it creates an openness. And part of this goes back to working with Susan. Susan was really a lesson for me, and continued to be over the years. In that, no, I was never a mentor. We were working together. And I really think that's a better approach.
I like that, almost like partners in learning.
Yeah, and we're always learning, and I'm always learning. And I know, and I've talked with our close colleague, Chris Dermont, about this, who was also a student I worked with, that it's reciprocal. And there's times, which is always interesting to me and striking, when I recognize that I'm suddenly the student and my student is suddenly the teacher, and this is a repeated process, which I love, and greatly appreciate it because it's important.
Yes, and Chris Darramont, alongside Chris Gianavali and Misty McDuffie and others, were such an integral part of bringing the research and the science into Raincoast. And Chris started as a student, really around the time that you joined Raincoast in 1999, working on his master's and then his PhD. And fast forward to today, he's the Raincoast chair of the Applied Conservation Science Lab at the University of Victoria and continuously learning from his amazing group of students. And, it just makes me think about how, there are so many guiding principles that have and continue to shape Raincoast's work and our approach to wildlife conservation. And one that comes to mind is something that you've said to us often: let's not let the science die. And, it made me think about when we were just recently talking about all the archives of this important research that's sitting at your house from, the early 1900s and how important it is to keep that stuff. And yeah, can you speak a little bit more about what exactly is meant by let's not let the science die?
And, it's kind of funny because that, as a core principle, really, the term first came to me, and nobody's going to remember this, but it came from Chris Gianavali. And I can't remember what the conversation, but it really, really struck me. And we were just sort of embarking on all of our scientific studies. But the phrase, as a core principle, is essentially emphasizes the importance of preserving and advancing scientific knowledge and research, not forgetting that. And it was for us, it was sort of, and for me, and recognizing again, coming from Chris, It's sort of served as a call to attention to protect the scientific integrity of the work that we were doing, and also to continue ensure that we would have continued funding and support for these kinds of scientific endeavors that we were embarking on, knowing that we were looking at we wanted to be doing this forever. But simultaneously, part of that was to promote the education and innovation in the fields of science. And ideally for us at the time, it was to be doing things that were non-intrusive, so that we were no longer, capturing and handling animals, et cetera. And I think the principle in itself underscores the belief that, scientific progress, and we don't deny that, is vital for addressing these global changes that we're seeing, and ultimately improving the quality of life for all of these animals that we're so interested in, like, the wolves and the bears and others that they're associated with. It's a better understanding of the world around us.
Yeah, and that leads to another important guideline or core value to our work at Raincoast is our conservation ethics, or wildlife welfare ethic. And when it comes to large carnivores and other species for that matter, it's not just about applying and advancing non-invasive research methods, but also about protecting the life requisites of these animals, which continue to be threatened by human activities and disturbance. And this has led us to, having many difficult conversations about science and ethics, particularly as it relates to, as we like to say, the mismanagement of wolves in British Columbia. And you often remind me and others that science does not give us the permission to do whatever we want. Can you talk a bit more about this important ethical principle?
Yes, it's one that, as we emphasize over and over again, ad nauseum probably for some, but it just comes down to some simple points that we need to recognize, and that's primarily that science, just by its nature, does not grant us permission in the ethical or moral sense to do anything. And we recognize it, and it's a method. And again, just for understanding the world through our observations and experimentation, maybe in some cases. And we recognize that science can provide us with knowledge, and I guess in some cases, the tools that allow us to make changes or advances, but it's still not a guide for ethical decision making. And that's really what the point of that is. Whether we should do something that is based on scientific knowledge, it really falls within the realm of ethics, morality, and in some cases, societal values. That's the point. It's possible to do really good science that's immoral and possibly unethical. And it can start, not only can the science be immoral or unethical, but the product of the science being used to, for example, do something and use that as a justification to do something can be unethical or immoral. And hoping that makes sense to people and to you as well. But again, just getting back to the point that science, it offers possibilities and choices, but it doesn't inherently provide any moral or ethical framework to make decisions about some of the possibilities that we see.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight the major link between science and ethics, that they're not divorced from one another, and the importance of having those conversations within diverse groups. I mean, you've served on numerous government, industry, and advisory committees, and have said that sometimes it just takes one person to ask about ethics, to, think about the experience of the animal. And that can have a huge impact on the trajectory of the policy being discussed. Can you talk a bit more about this?
Well, I think it's a really important point. And just, I know in my own lifetime, and the work that I've been involved in over the years, I remember a time nobody ever asked questions about the ethics of what we were doing or what we wanted to do. And it just wasn't a topic. And I remember even in the 1980s, and I was on one of the advisory committees for the Wildlife Society, which is an organization that for professional wildlife biologists and academics, et cetera, that we should be looking at developing an ethics code and guideline. And I really was laughed out of the room by people, that they couldn't believe I was even suggesting that. And I continued to pursue it to the point where I finally left the organization because they just said, no way, we're not doing that. And they were really clear about that. So I experienced that over a number of years with different groups and organizations, but gradually it became more of a consideration that wasn't earlier on recognized, even within universities, with the development of ethics review committees for people who are involved in research, animal care committees. None of that was there previously. It developed over time, but it was a recognition of the importance of ethics. And again, going back to our concept that science doesn't give us permission to do whatever we want to do. And you think about this, the kinds of things that even are happening in the world now, and examples of really good science that might be considered unethical or immoral to pursue or implement. And, things from like genetic engineering on humans, ideas of cloning, for example. What are some others? Well, how about artificial intelligence that we see nowadays in use for warfare? And more recently, all these surveillance technologies where we get into, monitoring people. And we get, I know when I was at university, there was still a lot of human experimentation without consent. So all of these kinds of things are important. It's not just within the fields that we're interested in, but I think it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's a really important consideration. And when I think about, other important aspects of what shapes Raincoast's work historically and in present day, I think about our longstanding relationships with Indigenous governments and communities, and really the value of converging these different knowledge systems and learning from others with different perspectives and different values and different cultures. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to the role that those relationships play in Raincoast's work.
Well, I think they play significant roles. There's no doubt about that. And they have from the very, very beginning. Part of that is because of the relationships that were developed over time, but early on at Raincoast with Indigenous peoples on the coast. And there were, major contributors to the research from Indigenous peoples that was being carried out by Raincoast. So one and clearest example was individual we'll call Lone Wolf. That was the name we used for him, and who worked with us closely on the initial research on coastal wolves that was being carried out by Chris Darmont, and from, again, his master's all the way up through his PhD. But we're contributing constantly to that work. And that sort of became a model for what Raincoast does and how we operate. And the direct acknowledgement, again, of working with others who may not be from the same background that we are culturally or otherwise. And it's again, that openness. But it's again, part of the foundation principles that Raincoast ascribes to. I think it involves the weighing of ecological and ethical and cultural considerations in everything that we do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just the importance of, what I enjoy the most, I think, working with Raincoast is the relationships that we can build with those that we're collaborating with, those that we're working for or with. And I think that really strengthens the research and just the experience that everyone has of being able to have sometimes really difficult conversations, but really transparent conversations with those that we're partnering with, and building that trust is really important too.
Yeah, I think it is a trust. And I would refer back to Chris Darmont and really being the model for that. And I think that's important that we have somebody to look to like Chris, and it makes a big difference in an organization.
Yes, I agree. It's truly amazing to have someone like Chris to look to and learn from. And his approach to relationship building has really guided how I've approached building relationships within community, and, really taking the time to nourish and build trust within those relationships over time. Well, I want to ask you a question that I've asked all of the women within the series, and our producer Sophia has asked me as well. What has working with wolves taught you about yourself?
Well, it sort of diminished me, to be honest, as to who I think I am, and that I think my importance and is much less than what I anticipated or thought it should have been, even from the time that I was a child. I'm just a part of something that's much, much larger, and it has taught me to be very considerate, I think, and open to others. And by others, I include not just people, but other species as well, in a way that I probably wouldn't have been if I hadn't, again, had an opportunity to work with wolves very, very directly, and to see them in their own lives and with the cultures that wolves have developed and their relationships with one another. That's been instructive for me. in a really important way. And I don't think it's, something that's unusual. I think, this is probably a fairly natural and normal thing in a person. We see it pretty much everywhere, certainly. And if we're getting back to morals and ethics, it's something that is encouraged, I think. And that's probably, for me, the most important thing that I've learned about myself is that I need to be more considerate of others and thoughtful.
That's a great lesson from the wolves. And what advice would you give young people who are interested in pursuing a career in wildlife science or field studies?
Don't be deterred. It's not easy. Sometimes it's very, very difficult. And often your interests as a young person overlap the interests of somebody who's already at a more mature state and involved in doing the kinds of things that you think you would like to do. And often it's not easy to approach those people and express your interests, but you should. And again, that's the point. Don't be deterred. And don't be deterred, particularly if you're just sort of ignored or rejected, because that's not uncommon. You just need to continue to persist and follow through on what really might be your dreams. This is really what I want to do. I know this is what I want to do. I'm so interested in these things. I just can't let go. And that's got to be the motivation for the continuation, of that effort. I think most of the time you'll be able to ultimately do what it is that you want to do. And that's so important in life, rather than doing something that somebody else wants you to do.
Yeah, being passionate or following your passions and your curiosity and the persistence. Definitely resonate with that. I think I emailed Raincoast 8 times. And also there was other women sharing about, your recommendations to reach out and then, it not being the right time but encouraging them to reach out again. And so it might not be the right time, but if you keep pushing, you could end up landing. It could be the perfect time. Yeah, that comes around.
And I think this is not an uncommon experience that people have. And some people are discouraged early on, and then they regret it later that they didn't continue to pursue it. And as you said, an expression of your curiosity, which influences your real interest in doing something, that's an important thing to emphasize to somebody who you're speaking with, or at least trying to connect with. That I think that's helpful in opening the doors for a more serious conversation.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Paul, for joining us on the podcast today. It's always a pleasure whenever we get to chat. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Chelsea. And as you know, it's been a pleasure to work with you too. And I'm excited by that continuously. So, thank you for just being who you are there. And this is really important. And we're going to continue doing the work that we're doing.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was hosted and recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
This series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger, a passionate field biologist, friend, and source of inspiration to many within Raincoast and beyond. Raincoast Radio is hosted by Chelsea Greer and produced by me, Sophia Osborne, with additional audio editing by Omar Salafu. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.